Let us pray. Father God, we pray that you would bless the meditations now of our hearts, of our minds, and that you would fill us with your truth, and that you bring before us the scenes, as it were, of Calvary, that Christ may be crucified, portrayed before our very eyes, and that seeing him, we might indeed put our hope, our trust, and our confidence in him because of who he is and what he has done for us. Amen. Well, the Washington Post is one of America's leading newspapers. I suppose for many of us, we'll associate it with the reporting that led to disclosing what became known as the Watergate scandal. It was the reporters, journalists on the Washington Post who worked on that story that eventually led to the resignation of Richard Nixon, the president, back in the 1970s. Well, anyway, the Washington Post in December of last year asked its readers if they could send in to them a word or a phrase that summed up the year 2020. And as you can imagine, they had many responses. Anyway, the top three were apparently exhausting, lost, and chaotic. So those are the three words that apparently came top in this kind of survey of their readers. And of course, newspapers often want headlines that have short, memorable words or phrases that people can latch onto. And this morning, as we meet for worship on this Friday, when we remember the Lord's death on the cross, well, as I was saying, the Washington Post is this famous American newspaper, and it had this survey to look at what readers thought of 2020 in a few words or phrases. And exhausting, lost, chaotic were the words they came up with. We're going to think about a short phrase uttered by Jesus on the cross as we meet for worship on this Good Friday. And the phrase comes in verse 30 of John chapter 19. And the phrase is, "It is finished." Just one word in the Greek of the New Testament, but it's a word or it's a phrase that's pregnant with meaning. And it's the last word, at least as John records the crucifixion scene, recorded by Jesus as he speaks from the cross. It was a word or a phrase that came at the end of a series of painful, humiliating, traumatic events for him. From his betrayal, having journeyed into Jerusalem, arrived at the Passover celebrations, to the arrest and the trial, and then the punishment that was meted out to him, leading up to him being put on the Roman crucifixion cross. I'd like to think about this phrase then with you this morning and see what it can tell us about the crucifixion and the significance of Jesus being crucified on the cross. And in keeping with this idea of the Washington Post, I'm going to take three, if you like, headline words to try and summarize it. And the first word is completion. Completion. Jesus is affirming a task completed. He's affirming a task completed. And that's very clear, really, from the description that John, the gospel writer, gives just a few words earlier in chapter 19. This is what John writes. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, or if you like, all was now completed, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I'm thirsty." So Jesus at this point on the cross knew that a mission or a task was coming to its fulfillment, its climax, its completion. And so he says, "It is finished. But what was that task? What was that mission that he had? Now, many of us have tasks and aims in our lives on a daily basis. We may have things that we have to do. Maybe there are some things that we're planning to do later today. And then on a bigger scale, we may have an aim in our lives. I suppose we tend to think of this for people who are younger in years. They're thinking about their career, aims and goals that they have ahead of them. But it can be true of all of us as well. We have certain aims or goals before us. And Jesus' life had a focus and an aim, a goal and a task ahead of him. In the early days of his ministry, again, as John records it, he told his disciples, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to complete his work." So he's saying there that he and the Father have this goal, this task in mind. And Jesus' aim in life is to fulfill that mission, that task. And throughout John's Gospel, as you read it, you'll notice that he speaks here and there, or John himself comments about Jesus' hour. Jesus' hour, a momentous moment that lay ahead of him. Early on in his ministry, when he was at a wedding, and he was asked to intervene because of the fact that the wine was running out, Jesus spoke about this hour right at the beginning of his ministry. He said, "My hour hasn't yet come," he said. But now his hour had come on the cross. And he knew that. And as John says, Jesus now knew that all was complete, all was now finished. He said, "It is finished." So what was this finished task? What was this completed aim or mission? I want to bring three things out to you now. John records Jesus early on in his ministry having a conversation with a Jewish leader, Nicodemus. And as part of this conversation, Jesus says, God did not send the Son, and he's referring to himself there, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. So here is Jesus saying, my purpose here is to save the world. Tremendous task. So Jesus, and John, as he records this, is saying, the world needs saving. The world needs saving. Now, these days, if we say something like that, the world needs saving, I would imagine that many people would think about saving the world ecologically, saving the planet because of potential destruction. That, I suspect, is what might come to many people's minds. Well, Christians can share that concern as well, of course, and have that concern about our planet. But when Jesus and John were speaking about saving the world, Jesus was thinking of delivering its people morally on account of lives and actions that were marked by darkness and not by light. Things that brought God's condemnation from the Maker. As Graham Kendrick's song, Come and See, speaks about all our pride, all our greed, all our fallenness, all our shame. We need to be saved from the condemnation that rightly comes to us because of those things. And those are just a sample of things. If you like, it's about avoiding a car crash. Now, people sometimes use that phrase to describe people's lives. They say, his life is like a car crash. It's something inevitable that's going to happen. There's something awful going to come or has happened. And that's what Jesus sees facing the people of the world, people like you and me. So he says, God has sent me here on this task, on this mission, that the world might be saved. And before Jesus got underway on this task, his forerunner, John the Baptist, could speak of Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And so John the Baptist, his forerunner, again, was very clear. He was in no doubt that this world of ours, in terms of its people, is marred by sin. Again, the kind of things that I've just mentioned now. Without thinking about extreme things, but can I say more ordinary things? Greed, pride, shame. These things that mark the lives of us all. So the Lamb of God steps in to take away the sin that brings about this impending disaster, this impending car crash that's waiting, as it were. So that's one thing, saving the world. The second thing, in the same conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus, Jesus speaks about himself as the Son of Man being lifted up. And by that he means being lifted up on the cross. So must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. And later on, Jesus could say, this is the will of him who sent me. So this is his purpose, this is his task. That I should lose nothing of all that is given me, but raise it up on the last day. This is indeed the will of my Father, that all who see the Son and believe in him may have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. And this is telling us something else then about Jesus' mission and his task, because he sees us as hostages, if you like, hostages to death, people in need of life, because we don't have life without Christ. So Jesus is not only saving us from a disaster, but he's also giving life. If I can keep that picture of a car accident, if you imagine a situation where somebody is seeing the potential for an accident and is able to warn the driver, perhaps on the side of the road, and yet that's one thing. But then maybe the accident has happened and he's then able to go and give CPR, for example. So not only saving life, but giving life. And Jesus himself is the shepherd who lays down his life in a sacrificial death that would bring life to others. I don't know if you've thought about this, but when Jesus speaks about the shepherd laying down his life for a sheep, in a sense, in one sense, if an actual shepherd did lose his life, the sheep would be in disarray. They'd potentially be in greater danger. But Jesus as a shepherd is different, because he lays down his life only to take it up again. And because he takes it up again, it isn't a disaster for the sheep, because that is the pathway for them to receive life. So Jesus is coming to save from disaster, but is also coming to give us life. And lastly, as a third aspect, immediately prior to his crucifixion, Jesus and the disciples, of course, were gathered for a final meal. And John, the gospel writer, says Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and to go to the Father. And having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Jesus loved those for whom he came. And his mission and his task were characterized by love. It's in love that he comes to save people from the condemnation of the maker of their lives. It's in love that he comes to give his life. And Jesus knew as he was facing the cross, I glorified you, he prays to God on earth, by finishing the work that you gave me to do. So as we think about this phrase, it is finished, the first word I'd like to bring to you is then completion. Jesus is affirming a task completed. But the second word I want to bring is the word triumph. Triumph. It's a cry of a triumph achieved. Now, on the face of it, as you looked at that scene of the cross, Jesus hanging there on the cross, it had all the appearances, not of triumph, but of failure. Because here was the one who had come and had spoken of the kingdom of God, and that he was announcing the coming of the kingdom. Here was the one who, when John the Baptist's disciples came and asked, well, are we to expect another, or is it you? He said to John's disciples, go back to him and say, look, here's the evidence. And in other words, the evidence is, I am the one. I am the anointed one of God. I'm the sent one. I'm the deliverer. And yet here he is, dying, being put to death. It had all the appearance of humiliation, disaster, and failure. And even this phrase that we're thinking about this morning, it is finished, could be understood in that way, in the way of failure. Oh, it's finished. It's over. A bit like people say today, perhaps of a sporting competition, and they're hoping that their team will get through and succeed and win, but they say, oh, it's finished. Our hopes of winning have been dashed. They've come to an end now. Or when people have perhaps an appliance in their home, or it's had it, it's over, it's no good, it's broken, that's done for. And if you think about the people who are at the cross, for many of them, that's exactly how it seemed. So we have the soldiers who mocked because everything looked a failure. The religious leaders who mocked because it seemed a failure. And even the disciples fled. And the women who went to prepare to anoint his body later did so because, well, it was all over, really. And you've got that verbalized by two disciples 3 days later, walking dejectedly from Jerusalem to their home, saying, but we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. But because Jesus as I've said, realized that he'd completed a task, he was able to say these words also with a sense of triumph. Despite the religious leaders opposing him, despite the secular authorities, despite the scheming of the evil one trying to frustrate his mission, he had triumphed because he had done the will of the Father in a way that none of us has done. That's our fundamental problem. As I've tried to explain, we have failed. We've missed the mark. We've deviated from a right and good course in life. We are the sinners. And whatever achievements we may have in our lives, when it comes to the most fundamental issues, we failed. We failed others, and we failed God, to whom we are accountable. But Jesus can say, without any embarrassment, without any false pride, that he had triumphed. He'd been obedient to God and his expectations. He really was the perfect man. And the proof that his words are a cry of triumph were not empty words, was that 3 days later, he was raised from the dead. And that's why the apostles later on were able to focus so much on the resurrection. They were able to say, this Jesus God has raised up, and we're all witnesses of it, because he was a risen, vindicated Messiah, vindicated that he had come to save the people of this world, vindicated that he'd come to give life, vindicated. Now, sometime later, Paul the Apostle could write of Jesus' words using a picture of a triumphant warrior. Writing to the Colossians in chapter 2, he says to his readers, when you were dead in trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Jesus when he forgave us all our trespasses, erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands. He set this aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in it. Paul there has got lots of pictures in those words. And one of them, he speaks about the record that stood against us with its legal demands. What was that stood against us with its legal? Well, it's God's law. It's his expectations standing against us, and in which we find ourselves debtors, really. And it's a bit like if you're leaving a hotel, perhaps, or a restaurant, and when you come at the end, you have to pay the bill. And it's there in front of you. And if you try to go out without paying, they'd hold it in front of you and they say, well, look, here it is. If you like, it's against you. It's got a demand. It's held up in front of you. You can't leave without this being settled and sorted out. That's what Paul is saying here. You can't leave. This needs to be sorted out. This needs to be settled. And Jesus is saying, it's finished. I've triumphed. I've completed the task. I've lived the perfect life. I've fulfilled all its obligations. The record that stood against us with its legal demands, he is now the representative of his people. And all his people can know that he has triumphed for them. And Paul has another picture here, this picture of making a public example of rulers and authorities. And elsewhere in his writing, Paul speaks about principalities, rulers, authorities in the heavenly realms. There is an evil personified in Satan and the devil. There are forces ranged against us. But Jesus had triumphed over them all. Just like a Roman warrior would come back from battle, and they literally would have these prisoners towed behind them. They would have the booty perhaps as well. And this is his picture. So this phrase then is a cry of a triumph achieved. So that's our second word, triumph. And the third word I want to bring before you is promise. Promise. Now, some promises, as they say, are not worth the paper that they're written on. You may have a guarantee, but what backs up that guarantee? People have fallen foul of this sometimes when they've bought products in the past, double glazing or whatever. The promise is only as good as that which stands behind that promise. But when Jesus says it is finished, because he's completed his task, because he's triumphed in his task, that's the backing to the promise then, that's a part of that word. He's saying, if you like, to everybody who's watching, everybody who sees his death, everybody who reads of his death, hears of his death, there's a promise. And it's a promise in which we can put our trust confidently. We can put our hope assuredly. And it's a promise of forgiveness. And it's a promise of forgiveness because due to his triumph, our slate is wiped clean. It was there in those words that I quoted from Paul's letter to the Colossians. He speaks about erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands, blotting it out, in other words. We can't just tear it up ourselves. Something has to be done. And Jesus has done it. And the promise is of forgiveness. Our debt to others, our debt to God, our bankruptcy, forgiven. Promise of forgiveness. Secondly, a promise of freedom as well. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed, said Jesus. There are many people, I'm sure, who long to be freed from persistent failure and persistent sin, but not able to do it. We find ourselves trapped. But as one hymn writer said, he breaks the power of cancelled sin. He sets the prisoner free. There really is a possibility of living a different life and a new life because of Jesus' triumph. There is really a promise of freedom for people. So many people have found that in their lives. One great hymn writer whose hymn has entered the pop charts, John Newton, was a slave trader. And his life was totally transformed. From being a slave trader, preying on people's lives, making money and profiting from this abominable trade, but he was himself a prisoner to that, but set free. And he sings about it in his famous hymn, Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The promise of freedom, freedom from things from which we cannot free ourselves. And as I've spoken earlier, freedom from the clutches of death itself, to which we are all hostages. A promise of freedom. And some of these things Jesus speaks about even on the cross. That promise of forgiveness. Doesn't he say at one point, Father, forgive them? Father, forgive? He could only say that because he had triumphed and completed. And lastly, a promise for the future. Promise of forgiveness, a promise of freedom, and a promise for the future. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but have eternal life. Jesus spoke so often, didn't he, of giving his life, the shepherd laying down his life to take it up again, that others might have life. You may think that because of your financial security, even the good things in life, appreciation perhaps of culture and enjoyment of sport and so on, that your life is full and complete. But it's partial and incomplete without the life that Jesus himself brings. I have come that they might have life and have it in all its fullness, Jesus said. And a life that will know no end for the future. And Jesus gives us a little glimpse into this as well on the cross, when one of those repentant robbers, thieves, rebels turns to him and says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says to him, today you'll be with me in paradise. He gives him a promise for the future. And that promise that he gives him for the future is a promise that he gives to everyone who looks to him, to Christ. It is finished. It's a word of completion. It's a word of triumph. And it's a word of promise. It's because of all of those things that we can call today Good Friday. Amen.